Today we're going to be talking about the synthesis of thyroid hormone. Okay? Today we're going to be talking about the synthesis of thyroid hormone, which is T3 and T4. You know, T3 and T4 stands for, T3 stands for triiodothyronine and T4 stands for thyroxine. Thyroid hormone is such a powerful hormone. It's one of the most major metabolic hormones in the entire body. It helps to promote so many different kinds of effects. What we're going to do is we're going to just go briefly over, general basic functional concepts of the thyroid hormone, and then we're going to go over how it's actually synthesized and released as well. So synthesis and the release of thyroid hormone. You know that the thyroid hormone is actually made by the thyroid gland. You know that right in your neck, in the anterior neck, just inferior to the larynx, okay, is actually going to be a structure, a butterfly-shaped gland called the thyroid gland. What is it called? It's called the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is actually going to be made up of multiple amounts of follicles. What is a follicle? A follicle is actually going to be the structural and the functional unit that is the smallest division that is responsible for synthesizing the thyroid hormone. The thyroid follicle is going to have these cells. They're epithelial cells. And these epithelial cells are going to be cuboidal or maybe even squamous-like follicle cells, and there's only a single row of them. And these are called the follicular cells. These are called the follicular cells. They're the ones that are responsible for producing a thyroglobulin colloid called, a colloid called thyroglobulin. And then sometimes you might hear of these cells sitting in between another thyroid follicle. I'm not going to draw all of them. Maybe I will. But these cells are called the para, meaning beside, the follicular cells. They're parafollicular cells or C cells. They're the ones that are responsible for releasing a polypeptide hormone called calcitonin. And the thyroid gland, which is consisting of thyroid follicles, they make a substance called thyroglobulin. And we'll go into all the details of it. But that is a thyroid follicle. And right in the lumen, the central cavity, is containing that amber-colored sticky material called thyroglobulin. It's just a whole bunch of tyrosine amino acids with attached iodine atoms. And we'll talk about all that stuff. Okay? But remember T3, T4. T3 is triiodothyronine. T4 is thyroxine. This hormone is such a powerful hormone. And here's another thing. Endocrine glands are hormone-producing structures, and they lack ducts. They're physiologically connected to blood vessels. You know that coming off of the external carotid artery is also going to be some branches like the superior and inferior thyroid arteries. And so there's superior and inferior thyroid arteries which supply the actual thyroid gland and break into arterioles and capillaries, specifically sinusoidal or fenestrated capillaries, to be able to pick up the actual thyroid hormone. But this gland affects so many systems. It promotes normal basal metabolic rate. It promotes normal oxygen use within the tissue cells. It helps to be able to enhance sympathetic nervous system stimulations. It helps to be able to produce heat. That's one of its main effects, is to produce heat, calorigenic effects. It can promote normal glucose catabolism for ATP production. It can help to initiate lipolysis, breaking down triglycerides into lipids. So many different functions. It can stimulate protein synthesis. It can even enhance the liver, its synthesis of cholesterol. It can affect our muscular system. It can promote normal muscular development and function. It promotes normal cardiovascular function, heart rate, contractility. It even affects the bones. It affects the actual digestive tract. It promotes normal GI motility and tone and even secretory activity. It affects the integumentary system. It affects the female reproductive system. It affects the nervous system. People who suffer in the infant stage of thyroid hormone can suffer from a condition called cretinism. It's hypothyroidism in infants, in which they actually suffer from possible mental retardation and slow brain development. And if it's in adults, we call it myxedema, and that's a very severe condition, which is hypothyroidism in adults, which can lead to low metabolic rate, low body temperature, a decreased appetite, It can lead to so many different kinds of effects. It can lead to multiple amounts of things. It can lead to lethargic effects. It can lead to mental sluggishness, a lot of different things. But we're going to go over all this. So let's talk about that. I drew a thyroid follicle. What I want to do is I want to zoom in on that thyroid follicle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a large thyroid follicle, and then I'm going to draw your circulatory system. So I'm just going to erase this, and we're going to draw circulation. So this is a capillary. What kind of capillaries, again, serve the actual thyroid gland? It could be two kinds of capillaries, because you know capillaries can be broken down into three kinds. It can be broken down to continuous capillaries, which are the least permeable, sinusoidal capillaries, which are the second most fenestrated, which are the second most permeable, and the most permeable, they're called sinusoidal capillaries. And so these kinds of capillaries serving endocrine glands could be fenestrated, or they could be sinusoidal. Mainly probably fenestrated, because sinusoidal are more common within the bone marrow, the liver, and within the spleen. But in certain endocrine glands you can find it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a thyroid follicle. You know that there's going to be those cells. Again, these are called cuboidal cells. So I'm just going to draw a couple here of cuboidal cells. Now you know that these cells are the ones that are responsible for producing all of this thyroglobulin. Let's talk about how it's produced. You know, within the brain there's a structure which is right anterior to the mammillary bodies. It's a limbic nuclei, and it's connected to the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. This structure is called the hypothalamus. You know, the hypothalamus contains neurons, ventral neurons, that release specific kinds of substances into a primary capillary plexus, and this primary capillary plexus will circulate down through the hypophyseal portal vein and into the second capillary plexus, and then into the anterior pituitary gland. And in the anterior pituitary there is going to be cells, and these cells are responsible for secreting a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. What is the function of thyroid stimulating hormone? Well, let's try to make sense of it. It stimulates the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone. So it's not that hard. So again, the central command starts within the hypothalamus. The neurons within the ventral portion of the hypothalamus release a specific kind of hormone called thyroid releasing hormone, which we can call TRH. TRH stimulates the anterior pituitary gland through the hypophyseal portal system, which is the connection, an indirect vascular connection from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. And in the anterior pituitary gland, when those cells are stimulated by TRH, they release TSH. Now, you know, TSH is actually going to be a protein hormone. You know, there's two different kinds of hormones. If we categorize hormones, you know, hormones can be broken into two categories. They can be broken into water soluble, which meaning that they're protein hormones, or lipid soluble. Well, you know, TSH is actually going to be a water-soluble protein. If it's a water-soluble protein, meaning that it's actually going to be a peptide. Okay? Peptide, meaning it's a protein. It contains a carboxyl end and an amino end. Okay? That means it cannot penetrate through the cell membrane. Because it cannot penetrate through the cell membrane, it has to exert its effects upon the receptors that are on the cell membrane. Okay, so there's, you know, there's basically there's three, but we're going to break it down to the simplest ones. There's the cyclic AMP second messenger system, and then there's the PIP2 calcium signaling mechanism. Well, TRH does the PIP2 calcium signaling mechanism, and TSH does the cyclic AMP second messenger system. So we're going to briefly remember, we're going to briefly go over that really quickly. That way you guys don't get confused on that, because there's two ways that a hormone can affect its target cell. It can have receptors inside the cell or receptors outside the cell. Lipid-soluble hormones have receptors inside the cell. Why? Because they can penetrate through the cell membrane, because they are lipid-soluble. But protein or peptide-based hormones, they can't penetrate through the cell membrane, and because they can't penetrate through the cell membrane, that means that they have to be able to have extracellular receptors, which they exert their signaling effects on. Let's briefly go over this on a single cell. Let's use this cell, for example, and just because of room, we're going to put we're going to say that the hormone's affecting here, but I'm just using this as an example. You know, there's different kinds of receptors. This receptor for TSH is called a 7-pos receptor because it passes through the membrane 7 times, or you can just call it a serpentine receptor because it looks like a snake. When TSH, which we're going to draw red here, binds onto this 7-pos receptor, this 7-pos receptor is connected with a G protein. You know, there's G proteins in our cells. If it's the cyclic AMP second messenger system, it is the G stimulatory protein for TSH, because there's other hormones. We'll put here TSH. He's smiling at you. He's got hair too. This is G stimulatory protein. G stimulatory protein will be activated by the receptor, because once this hormone binds onto the target cell, the receptor changes its shape. You know, proteins are facing this way, but whenever TSH binds onto it, changes the shape of the receptor, and then the receptor, once it's activated, begins to activate the G stimulatory protein. How does it do that? It spits out a GDP, guanosine diphosphate, and causes it to become displaced with GTP. What does GTP do? GTP turns on the G protein, so this is the on switch, and GDP turns off the G protein, so this is the off switch. When GTP binds onto the G stimulatory protein, this protein is mobile. It can move along the cell membrane. When it moves along the cell membrane, it binds onto a effector enzyme. Okay, this is the receptor, this is the signal transducer, and this right here is going to be called the effector enzyme. What is the name of this effector enzyme? It is called adenylyl cyclase. What does adenylyl cyclase do? Adenylyl cyclase uses an enzyme called GTPase. GTPase breaks down the GTP into GDP and an inorganic phosphate. What will the GDP do to the G protein? It'll turn the G protein off. Now, there's a phosphate here that has been lost. There's been enough energy by the adenylyl cyclase breaking that bond that now ATP can come up and sweep across this adenylyl cyclase, and adenylyl cyclase that turns ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP then goes and activates an inactive enzyme. How do I know it's inactive? Look, it's sleeping. It's sleeping. What does it do to this protein kinase A enzyme? It activates the protein kinase A enzyme by doing what's called an activation. It just activates the enzyme. Now it's wide awake, smart, educated, has hair, smiling. He's awake. This is protein kinase A. Protein kinase A does mechanisms called phosphorylation mechanisms, where he adds phosphate groups to various amounts of enzymes and proteins. What does that have anything to do with all of this? The whole purpose of this is that this protein can't get into the cell. So he has to exert his effects outside the cell so that the chemical inside the cell can do the work that he could have done. And that's activate this enzyme. This enzyme is a very powerful enzyme. It's called protein kinase A. And what he does is he adds phosphate groups. You know, phosphate is an energy compound. It can do so many different things. Like what? What is the whole purpose of this? It can open ion channels. Open or even close ion channels. So it can open or close ion channels. It can affect cell membrane permeability or potential. It can stimulate protein synthesis. It can induce secretory activity. It can stimulate mitosis. It can lead to the effect of thousands of regulatory molecules. So many different things. It can trigger contractions. So many different effects. But this is what TSH is doing. And when TSH does this, this is what he begins to do. Let me show you what he begins. Now you understand the cyclic AMP second messenger system. Now we can actually go in and understand how this works. So let's draw this cell, and then let's take a break, and then we're going to come back and do this again. Take a break.